Hey, what's up? Burning Earth Chris reporting in for Burning Earth Productions. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you guys how to create some really cool looking sci-fi energy shields. Now, a lot of you are probably familiar with the ones from Halo and StarCraft. Those are the ones that we're going to be covering today. So, let's take a look. Very cool, huh? But yeah, I'm going to go step by step over this process, show you guys how to make the best looking energy shields out there. And hopefully you guys will pick up a couple other tricks and tips that you'll be able to use in your visual effects career along the way. So, alright, so before we get started, I just want to let you guys know that I will be using Adobe After Effects and 3D Studio Max for this tutorial. You don't have to use that software. If you can use, say, Blender or Hit Film Express to do this stuff, you are more than welcome to use it, as long as you know the basic principles that are outlined in this tutorial. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a shockwave element, and just going to create a new composition here, and we'll make it a square. 2048 by 2048 should be okay. 24 frames per second is fine, and maybe we'll make this about 2 seconds. Very, very short. So next what we're going to do is we'll create a new solid, and we're going to make it white. And we're going to call this shockwave core. Now, next what we're going to do is we're going to draw a mask around the top edge of the solid here. So that looks pretty good. And what we'll do next is we'll feather out a little bit. So maybe about 150 pixels. That looks all right. Yeah, that looks pretty good. And over the course of these 2 seconds, we're gonna make this solid come up rather than go straight down. So what we need to do is we need to keyframe the mask path. So set this keyframe over to beginning and select the mask. You can hit Control T or Command T on your Mac, and you can move this up just a few pixels, just until it's out of frame. Maybe one more. That looks good. And we'll get this a quick preview. Alright, that looks pretty good. So, next what we'll do is we'll duplicate the solid here, and we're going to go into the solid settings, and we'll rename this to Shockwave Rim. And we're going to do a couple of things different with this solid. It'll use the same mask essentially, but we're going to maybe shrink it down a little bit. So maybe we'll set the expansion to -25. Maybe a little more than that. How about -50? Okay, that looks pretty good. So instead of moving this one up, we're going to move this one all the way down. So it's just out of frame here. So we'll select the mask, Control T, and then we'll just drag it all the way down up to about here. And then we'll set a keyframe for the feather and expansion, and drag these two to the very beginning. And what we'll do is we'll both increase the feather amount, so maybe we'll do 300 for this, and the expansion will go all the way down until the solid completely disappears. So about 125 should be alright, and we'll preview this. Alright, looks pretty good. Maybe I'll decrease the expansion to -75 pixels, because we kind of want this rim to be kind of thin, and we'll also decrease the feather amount as well. So -75. Yeah, that looks alright. And with the two elements combined, we get something that looks kind of like this. This is all happening over 2 seconds. So what we'll do now is we'll set these elements to add, so this way they'll composite correctly, and once we bring this element into 3D Studio Max, it'll look just fine. So what we'll do is we'll rename this composition to Shockwave Before Polar, and then we'll create a second composition, same size, and we'll call this Shockwave bit OCD about that. Shockwave, polar coordinates, and hit enter, and we'll drag the shockwave before polar into this. Then what we'll do is we'll create a new adjustment layer, and in this adjustment layer, what we're going to do is we're going to add the effect called polar coordinates. And if this method does look familiar, it's because Video Copilot's Andrew Kramer did a very similar tutorial on this. I'm not going to do too much with this shockwave in this tutorial. You can if you want to. But for the sake of this tutorial, and just to give you guys a basic idea, I'm just going to do something very simple here. So polar coordinates, and we'll drag this into the adjustment layer. We'll rename this adjustment layer to polar, just to give us the idea there. And we'll set the interpolation to 100%. Well, notice that's not looking very good. It's looking a little distorted here, but we don't want that kind of distortion. So we're going to set this from polar to rect to polar. And if we play this back, you can see that the shockwave now looks like a circle, and that's exactly what we want. And if you want to, you can go ahead and adjust the thickness of both the ring and the core as well. But I'm going to leave them as they are in this tutorial, so to me they look alright. And in order to export this, all we need to do is just go into Composition, add to render queue. I'm going to export this as a Targa sequence. Again, export this however you see fit, as long as it has transparency on it. So once I'm done exporting this, I will meet you in 3D Studio Max. Alright, so here we are in 3D Studio Max. What we're going to do is we're going to use the particle flow system. Very powerful stuff, probably the most powerful stock system that comes with 3D Studio Max for this. So we're essentially going to be creating a shockwave of particles in this segment here. So I've created a particle flow source, so I'll just make a couple of quick adjustments on this. This doesn't really impact the particle system too much at large, but yeah. Alright, so looks good. And go into particle view. This is where the real particle stuff happens here. So what we'll do is I'm going to delete the rotation and the shape events in this particle flow. And for the position icon, what we're going to do is we're going to set this to pivot. And you'll notice that all the particles were emitting from the within the circle, but now they are just emitting from the center point. So that's what we want here. So speed to 300 looks alright. I'll set a bit of variation to this, so like maybe about 100. And yeah, you'll notice that there's a bit more randomization in these particles now. So what we'll do next is we'll set the direction to random horizontal, and we'll set the divergence to about 5. And what this will do is it'll set them so that they spread outwards from the center, and it'll also set particles within a 5-degree arc of the particle system. So, but it's spawning too many. I mean, the particles are spawning too slowly. So what we'll do is we'll set the emit stop to 1 frame. Again, this is going to be a shock wave, so it's going to be very quick. So looks pretty good. Something else we should do while we're here is we'll set the time configuration. We'll set this to film. That's about 24 frames per second, and we'll set this to about 72 frames, and that's about 3 seconds. So hit OK there. That looks good. So next, what we'll do is we'll add a delete modifier to this. So essentially what this will do is we can delete all the particles, we can delete a select few particles, or we can delete them by particle age. In this case, we want particle age. So lifespan 48, variation of 8. That looks alright for now. And you'll notice that with the delete modifier present, the particles do fade off over time, which is exactly what we want. So next, what we need to do is we need to add a spawn event. So what we'll do is we'll just drag this here, and align this to the right, and we'll set the travel distance, we'll set it to by travel distance. So what this is going to do is it's going to spawn a whole bunch of particles, and you'll notice that this got a lot more particles, and we don't necessarily want that many. So before we do anything else, we kind of need to differentiate these particles. So what we'll do is we'll add a display modifier, and we'll just connect these two here, and now the spawned particles are showing up as little red ticks. So, and again, to differentiate them, we'll switch these to dots, and that looks all right. What we'll do next is we'll set the step size to maybe about 0.5. This will This will decrease the amount of particles that we have going on here. Divergence, we'll set that to 0. Inherited speed, we'll set that to maybe about 50%. Looks alright. But I don't like the way that these particles are just stopping there, you know what I mean? So maybe we'll set this to about, we'll set this back up to 100, and the variation will go to, maybe we'll set the variation to about 50, to about 25%, and divergence to about 5. Nah, that's too much. How about 1? That looks okay. And next what we need to do is we need to add a similar delete modifier to, oops, sorry about that. We need to add a similar delete modifier to the second event here. So we'll just copy and paste this, the one from the first event. So that looks good. And now all the particles are fading. Maybe we'll increase the time a little bit. So maybe we'll do this to about 4 seconds. Math is failing me at the moment, so so I don't know how many frames that is. 96 frames, okay. I figured it was about that. Okay, I don't like that they're kind of stopping like that, so maybe we'll set the step size back up to 1. And maybe we'll have this, we'll set the delete value to 24. So that'll be over 1 second. Alright, and now they all fade out. That looks pretty good. So, next what we need to do is, we need to create a camera. So, that'll capture all of these particles. So, I'll just create a free one, and what we'll do is we'll center it in the middle of the viewport. From perspective view, we're going to select the camera view, and what we want to do is we want to try to capture the edge of the particles that are showing up here. So, we drag this up the camera just high enough to get all the particles in. And something that'll help us, especially when it comes to rendering time, is activating the save frame. So by pressing Shift and F or selecting the camera in the viewport and then clicking show save frames, now we can see where the particles are going to end at the edge of the viewport. So that looks pretty good. And next what we'll do is we'll go to rendering, render setup, and again we're going to make this 2048 by 2048. So let's see, 2048. And when you adjust the render parameter, you'll notice that the save frames change to fit that as well, so that's very cool. We can move the camera a little bit further down, so maybe, whoops, too much. Maybe down to here. No, some of the particles are escaping the view, so maybe about here. This is something that you really gotta fine tune. So maybe I'll leave it at about 4,000. And that looks pretty good. One more thing that we need to do is, we don't need to add any geometry for this section, but we should add some for the second event here. So what we'll do is we'll add a shape modifier, shape event, I'm sorry, and we'll set this to sphere 20 sides, and we'll set the size to about maybe 2.5. And next what we'll do is we'll add a material for these particles. So we'll add a material dynamic event underneath the shape event, and we'll select reset particle age, and then we'll go into the material editor real quick. So material editor, I'm going to use the compact material editor. That's the one that I'm most used to here. You can use slate editor if you want. They both function the same way. And what we'll do is we'll create a new material called particle, and we'll just make this white. And in the map slot, what we'll do is we'll create a new particle age map. So we're going to swap color 3 and color 1. So color 1 should be black. Color 1 should be white, color 2 should also be white, and then color 3 should be black. And we can just copy and paste this, or just drag it down into the self-illumination channel here. We'll make it an instance in this case. So when you make an instance of something, if you affect one instance, then all the instances of it will be affected. If we made it a copy, then it wouldn't be the same way. So, and what we'll do is we'll drag the particle material into the material dynamic slot here, and we'll set this as an instance, and we'll choose OK. And we'll give this a quick test render to see how it looks. So, where's the dialog? There it is. Okay, behind my material editor. And we'll just render a single frame, see how it looks. Okay, not too shabby. Maybe what we could do is we could adjust the divergence of the particles a little bit. Just a smidge, not too much. So maybe we'll set it to 0.5 instead, and we'll add a variation of about 50. Just to make the explosion a little bit more, the shockwave a little bit more, a little bit bigger. That looks pretty good. Maybe what we'll do is we'll also decrease the age to 12, see how that looks. We don't want this to be too, we don't want these streaks to be too long. That looks alright. So maybe what we'll do is we'll also go back to the first event and set that lifespan to 24 frames. So that's very good. That's good. Alright, so now what we'll do is we'll just move the camera in. Again, this part does require a lot of fine-tuning, so please feel free to adjust accordingly to your to fit your own needs here. That looks okay. Alright, good. Now we'll do another quick test render here. Alright, not too bad. Maybe we'll do one more at 24 frames per second just to make sure that it looks good. And that looks good. Okay, so once you're done adjusting your particles, essentially what you have to do is just render this out. And again, I'm going to render this out as a Targa sequence. And but again, do whatever you feel is best for your project. As long as it has an alpha channel, you should be fine. So I'll render this out, and then I'll see you guys in the next step. Alright, so here I am in a new 3D Studio Max scene. I've imported one of these Starfighter models by Stefan Chasloop. You can purchase them for between $15 and $30 on CG Trader. I'll leave the link in the description below. Anyway, so what I've got here is I got this simple scene set up. I'm not going to really do too much animation with it. Just a simple setup. So, first off, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my ship in a new layer, so I'll just call this ship. Okay, and then I'm going to create a new layer for the for what we're about to do next. So we'll call this one shield particles, and which is okay. And what we'll do is we'll create another layer called shield geometry, and which is okay. And what we'll do is we'll create a geosphere around our ship. You can create a sphere if you want to, but I just prefer to use geospheres. So we'll just center it around our ship here, and maybe we can shrink it down just a touch. But first we'll call this shield impact geometry. And again, we'll shrink this, bring the segments up to about 10, and shrink this down just enough so that it's covering the ship. So maybe about 1,000. That looks good. Now what we'll do next is we will center our view on it, and what we'll do is we'll right click, choose object properties. Okay, you can see that, and we'll uncheck renderable here, and that looks good. Now maybe what we can also do is we'll go back into object properties, I'm sorry, and we'll go into object properties and we'll check see-through, and there we go. Now we can see the dropship through the bubble here, so that looks good. Next, what we'll do is we'll go into the shield particles layer, and what we'll do is we'll create a particle system, and we'll use PS source again. So just create one here, and we're gonna call this shield impact system. And what we'll do is we'll make the size of it about this, and that looks good. And 100% particles. And what we'll do before we go into adjusting any particle stuff is we'll assign a look at constraint to this. Excuse me. We'll assign a look at constraint to this particle system. So what is a look at constraint? I'll explain in just a second. So go to the motion tab and select rotation on the particle system and select assign controller. And now we have this list here. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a look at constraint. And when you add a look at constraint, it means that this object will always face another object. So we'll add a look at target, and if I press H, we can bring up our pick object menu, and we'll just select the dropship here. So, and you'll notice that as I move it, one side of the particle system will always face the dropship no matter how much I move this. So what we're going to do is we're going to set it to look at the Z axis, and we're going to set it to flip, and this way the arrow is pointing towards the dropship, and that's what we want. So now you notice that all the particles are flying towards the dropship here, so that's good. That's good news. That's what we want. So again, before we continue, I'll set this to maybe about 5 seconds here. Not too long, and that looks all right. And set this to frames. That's about 120 frames, so we'll hit OK, and that looks good. Now, what we'll do next is we'll go into the particle view here, and again, location, pivot, and now all the particles will be coming out of the pivot point. But we're going to increase the speed a little bit, but first we'll delete the rotation and shape events here, and we're going to name this event shield impact generate. You can name this laser if you want to. I'm not going to cover making a laser in this tutorial, but it's fairly simple. You can also do it, you can do it either through the particle system itself, or you can use After Effects. But either way, I'm just gonna cover the shield effect in this tutorial. So what we'll do next is we'll create we'll increase the speed a little bit, and we'll also decrease the number of particles first, actually. So maybe we'll set the amount to, we'll just do about 3 particles. This is a tutorial. So 3 particles should be fine, and we'll set the emit stop to about we'll up that to about 48, so they'll be spread out a little bit more. And we'll set the speed up to maybe about 1,000. So they're coming out a little bit faster. No, still a little too slow. So maybe what we'll do is we'll set this to 2,500 instead. We're not going to add too much variation to these. Still a little too slow. Maybe how about 5,000? Again, trial and error here. That looks good. Okay, that looks more like, that looks better. So, what we'll do next is a long icon arrow looks good, and what we're gonna do is we're going to add a spawn collision event. So, look for a spawn collision event. I'm sorry, collision spawn event. So, got the words mixed up there. So, align right, and in the collision spawn event, what we need is we need a deflector here. So, and a deflector essentially allows particles to interact with objects. So I'll minimize particle view for a second and I'll make a new deflector here. So the deflector will be found in the space warps under the drop down menu under deflectors, and we're going to create a U deflector here. So that looks good, and we'll call this shield deflector. And what we'll do next is we'll pick the shield geometry as our object, shield impact geometry as our object, and we're going to set all values here in this dialog option to 0. So no bounce, no inherent velocity, no friction, nothing like that. And what we'll do is we'll add the deflector to our collision spawn event. And what happens is once that's added, not sure if you can see this here. Let me actually adjust that. You'll notice that this little tick right here is actually the particle, and it has stopped. It has stopped moving on once it hits the shield. That's exactly what we want. So what we'll do now is we'll use a shape mark. So we're gonna drag this out into a new event here. So shape mark, and we're gonna call this event. We'll call this shield impact. And we're going to call this shield, we're actually going to call this shield impact shockwave. We're going to do 2 events like this, but we're going to set up one event first, and then we'll use the first event to set the other one up. So we'll connect these 2, and this shape mark, we just need to set the contact object to the shield impact geometry once again. And for display, we're going to set this up to geometry, just so that we can see what's going on here. So alright, that's done. Now what we can do is we can set the size up, and we'll set this to box intersection here. And what box intersection does is when a particle impacts onto an object, box intersection allows the resulting spawning particle to take the shape of the collision object. So what we'll do is we'll increase the size, maybe start off with about 100 length and width, and then the box height, we'll adjust that as well. That's kind of small, I don't really like that. So I'll set the box height to 250 and the width and the length to 250. Still kind of small, maybe we'll bring them up even more to about 1,000. And maybe we'll adjust the box height the same way. And that looks good. That looks much better. Yeah. Okay, so shield impact shockwave. Now you notice that this particle here is is conforming to the shape of the geosphere. That's exactly what we want. So if I render this real quick, what we'll see, I'll render this in 1080. What we'll see is, I'm sorry, I forgot to set this in perspective view. But what we'll see is we'll see this particle here. Now, remember those elements that we rendered in After Effects and 3D Studio Max? They're going to come in handy pretty here in just a second. So what we'll do is we'll open up the material editor. Again, I'll use compact material editor. And we're going to create a new material, and we're going to call this shockwave. And what we can do now is in the diffuse map slot, we'll select it and we'll choose bitmap, and go ahead and scroll over to your shockwave element that you rendered from After Effects and select the first frame, and it'll take us about a second. And then what we're going to do is we're going to set this as a sequence, so make sure that this box is checked, and we'll hit open. And this looks good, hit OK. And essentially what we've done is we've imported the entire shockwave image sequence here. So if I scrub through the frames, you'll notice that the shockwave is appearing over time. That's good. So to get a better idea of what we're looking at here, I'm going to set this to a cubic shape here. And back in the main shockwave parameters, I'll set the diffuse color to black. I'm going to make sure this is two-sided, And what we need to do is we need to just drag and drop it into the self-illumination slot as an instance, and the opacity slot as a copy. And in the opacity slot, we're going to set the RGB channel output to alpha as gray and mono channel output to alpha as well. And oh, look at that, it completely disappeared. Better yet, we'll just make it an instance in this case. Sorry, folks. And then we'll set the self-illumination color. We're going to check the color box here, and the shockwave should appear a little bit brighter. So, finally, what we'll do in the extended parameters, what we'll do is we'll set this to additive, and that looks good. Now, what we need to do now is we'll move the material editor over, and again, we're going to add a material dynamic. So right underneath the shape mark here, just material dynamic, and drag the shockwave into the material dynamic slot. And as an instance, we'll hit reset particle age. And one more thing that we need to do in the material editor is in the shockwave element rollout, we have to go down to the time drop down menu and select end condition to hold and sync the frames to the particle age. Now what this will do is, if we had this set to loop, the animation would have looped over and over until the particle essentially dies. And if we sync the frames to particle age, that means that every particle will now have its own unique animation set up on it. So once the particle spawns in, then it'll have its own, it'll play back its own sequence. Does that make sense? I hope it makes sense to you guys. Anyway, so if we do a quick, let's see, right around here, if we do a quick render, we can see now that the shockwave is now appearing on just outside of the dropship, and that's exactly what we need. So what we're going to do is we're going to copy and paste this event, and we're going to rename this to Shield Impact Particle. Actually, we're going to name this a Shield Impact Particle Explosion. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a new material, and actually, better yet, what we can do is we can drag this into a new material slot, and we're going to call this Particle Explosion. And for the diffuse map, what we're going to do is we're going to actually, we're gonna clear this out, and we're gonna make a new bitmap. So go ahead and find your stock particle element that we rendered from 3D Studio Max. Find the image sequence for that. Make sure that sequence is selected as before, and we'll hit open. It looks good. Okay. And again, set up the end condition to hold, sync frames to particle age, and that should be just fine. And then what we'll do is we will drag the diffuse color slot into both the self-illumination and opacity maps here. So that should be all right. We're not really seeing anything right now, but that's okay. What we'll do next is we will see this wire here. We're gonna drag, and we're gonna make sure that the icon looks, that your pointer looks kind of like that big X. So essentially what that does is we disconnected the Shield Impact Shockwave event from the Shield Impact Generate event. So we're going to reconnect the collision spawn to the Shield Impact Particle Explosion event. And for the material dynamic too, we're going to drag the particle explosion material into the material slot there. So we'll hit instance, and that looks good. And for this, we're going to change the shape mark from a box intersection to a rectangle. And if we render this, there we go, there's our particle. And essentially what we're going to do is we're going to render this out in passes. And when I say that, I mean we're going to render out first just the shockwaves, then we're going to render out the particle explosion, then we're going to render out the dropship. And once all that's done, we're going to import all of that into After Effects, and we're going to do compositing in it. So First, what we're going to do is we're going to reconnect the shield impact generate to the shield impact shockwave. We're going to render this out first, and just to make things interesting, I'll add a bit of animation to our I'll add a bit of animation to our shield impact system. So we'll just move this over just to give the particles a bit of dispersion here so we can see it. And as you'll notice over time, the particles impact on the shield geometry, and that creates our particles. One more thing that we should do to our particle system is we should add a delete modifier to delete these over time. So what we'll do is we'll add a delete modifier to the shield impact shockwave, and by particle age, we'll set that to about 48. That should be fine. And that looks okay. And as we'll see here, if we render this out at this frame, you can barely see it, but it looks like one of the particles is already faded out. There's another one here, and that looks alright. So, yeah, okay, so we'll copy this, and then we'll paste it into the particle explosion, and maybe we'll set this up to about 72, because I think the particles last a bit longer than the shock waves do. So, once that's done, you should be all set to render then. So I'm gonna add a bit more to this scene. I'm gonna add like an ambient light and a key light here, just to add some just to make things a little bit more interesting. So just do this really quickly. Ambient light, I'll set the multiplier to 0.2, get this a dark blue color because I love color blue whenever I'm doing space scenes here. No. Okay, that looks all right. And then I'll add a key light for the sun here. Target direct. Set the target at the center here. Call this key light. Intensity to 1.5. I'll make the key light yellow, kind of like the sun. And directional parameters, I'll just turn on overshoot and set the fall off field to 50,000. One more thing I think we should do is we have to go into each of these events and go to the properties and make sure that these particles do not cast or receive shadows. So just do that for every event. Shouldn't take very, very long, hopefully. Yeah, this is only going to take me like about 10 seconds. Provided 3D Studio Max responds to me. Alright, that's good. There we go. Cast receive shadows off. Okay. Alright, so now that we have that set up, let's just do a quick render preview here. Make sure that it looks passable enough, at least. I think I'll brighten up the ambient light a bit. Give it a little more color to it. And let me adjust the key light here a little bit. This is not a lighting tutorial, folks, so if it's kind of sloppy, I apologize. Then you'll up the ambience to 1. Oh, that's why, because it isn't set to an ambient light. So, advanced effects, ambient only. That's better. Okay. That looks pretty good. So I'm not gonna add too much more to this to the scene here. I'll create a simple camera setup real quick. Standard camera from view, that should be okay. Again, just centered on the dreadnought. Sorry, the dropship here. Yeah. Whoa. Well, not too much here. Looks okay. So what I'll do is just add a really quick movement here. Just something simple. Yeah, that should be alright. Okay, so now that I've set all this up, we'll go ahead and turn on the safe frames, make sure everything looks good here, and it does. And what we're going to do is we're going to turn off the shield geometry, and we're going to turn off the ship layer. So what we're going to do is, you'll notice that the particles are still showing up here. That's exactly what we want. So we just want to render the shockwaves right now. So what we want to do is we're going to set up a new folder, and we'll call this if Max responds to me. Just give it a second, folks. And we're going to call this new folder shockwave render. Important that we call it shockwave render so that we don't end up overwriting our shockwave element. And we'll set this to targas, and we'll call this shockwave element again, and underscore, which is okay. And something that we should do before we render this is we'll actually turn our dropship layer back on, and we'll create a clone of it. So clone, and we'll set this as a copy, and we'll call this clone dropship MS. And MS is going to stand for, hold on, I'll show you guys in a second, dropship matte shadow. And we'll choose OK. And turn off the ship layer, and we'll go into the material editor, create a new material, and just click standard, and then we'll choose matte shadow here. So we'll call this matte shadow dropship, and that looks good. So dropship MS, apply, and you'll notice that it looks white, but that's okay. That's exactly what we need. So that looks good. Hit render, and you'll notice that nothing really appears here, but if we select display alpha channel, again, nothing appears here. So, but the impact does, and that's good. So, alright, I think we should be good to go. So, again, shockwave element, that looks good, and just render away, and see you guys for the next part. Alright, so the shockwaves have finished rendering out, so we'll X that out, and what we'll do is we'll reconnect our collision spawn to the shield impact particle explosion event here. So just a quick press F9 to make sure that we're doing things correctly here, and it does look good. So again, we'll create a new folder for our next image sequence, and again, particle render, not particle element. So and that looks good. So again, render as targets, and make sure that the matte shadow dropship is on, and see you guys in a few seconds. Alright, so I'm back, and now that we've rendered out our particles, we can go ahead and render out the dropship itself. So I can turn on, I'm going to turn off shield particles, and that essentially turns off our particle system, so that's what we need. I'll turn off dropship matte shadow, and it should render just our dropship here. So if we do a quick sorry, again, forgot to lock into the camera viewport there. Okay, that looks good. Now all we need to do is just render our dropship out. Again, this is going to be a really simple animation, so we'll just make a folder for dropship. and dropship. And well, what I'm also going to do is I'm also going to add in some of our render elements. So, for example, we'll add in an alpha channel, specular, and self-illumination, and that should be all right for the purposes of this tutorial. I don't think we really need anything else for now. But again, if you need more render elements, go ahead and add them if you feel so inclined. And time segment to 0 to 120, and I'll see you guys in After Effects next. Alright, so here we are in Adobe After Effects, and essentially what we need to do is we just need to implement our rendered image sequences from 3D Studio Max. So just right click in the project panel, import multiple files, and I already have this folder up here, so just copy and paste it. And I also rendered out a background while I was off screen, so I'll just implement that as well and do something real quick with that. Now, when you render something out with render elements, one way to keep track of which render element you're importing into Max is just right-click, view, details, and just drag the name over, and you'll be able to see whether this sequence is an alpha file, this sequence is a self-illumination file, specular, etc. You can also split them up into separate folders and do that in 3D Studio Max itself, but yeah. Alright, so alpha, self-illumination, specular, main pass, and particle render. That should be good. Shockwave render. I accidentally named this shockwave element, so I do apologize for that. But that should be good. And I think that's all we've got here. So I'll hit done, and I'll split these up into folders real quick. So I'll make one for background, dropship, particle element, and shockwave element. And that looks good. I'll open these up again, and what I'm going to do is when we render this, we're going to make this a 24 frames per second video. So first off, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up our color depth to 32 bits per channel and use the sRGB IEC 61996-2.1 working space, and then choose linearized working space. And essentially what this does is it'll allow for maximum color information to be stored in our video. So we'll just hit OK there. And I'm going to make a new composition, 24 frames per second, about 5 seconds. And we're going to call this main comp. And of course make sure it's 1920 by 1080, and that looks good. Here we are. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to implement our dropship. I'm just going to make this a very, very quick setup. And you'll notice that, like I said, we were doing this in 24 frames per second, but After Effects is reading this as 30 frames per second. So what do? So we right click on our footage in the project panel and go to Interpret Footage and Main. And we have to assume this frame rate, but we have to type in 24 frames per second instead of 30 and hit OK. And we can do this for every single render element, but ain't nobody got time for that. So what we do is go back down to Interpret Footage, remember interpretation, or hit Control-Alt-C, then select all of your other render elements that we have here, and then just press Control-Alt-V, and it will apply it to every single one of them. So now, this is registered at 24 frames per second, this one's registered 24 frames per second, you guys get the idea. So, just drag this out here, and dropship looks good. So, next what we'll do is, we'll just set up the alpha channel here for the dropship, and we'll set this to alpha matte, and what we'll do is we'll for the alpha matte, we'll just blur it out just a touch, make it better blend in with the background a little bit. So just hit 1, repeat on edges, and next what we'll do is we'll implement the specular channel. So just drop that over top, and we're going to set this to add, and what we'll do is we'll just do a fast blur method of this. So repeat on edges, and we'll set this to 2, and duplicate 4, and duplicate it again, 8, duplicate it again, 16, duplicate it one more time, and 32. And what we'll do is we'll select all of these specular elements, and we'll hit Control-Shift-C, and we'll call this new pre-comp dropship specular, or just dropship spec in this case. So that looks good, and we'll just set this to collapse transformations. And I'm not sure if you guys can really notice this. It really isn't that noticeable in this case, but it's a little bit noticeable. The dropship has a bit more of a metallic sheen on this part here, this section here. Again, not quite noticeable, but noticeable enough. So what we'll do is we'll go into the project panel, and we're going to duplicate the dropship spec composition, and then in the composition settings of that one, we're going to call this dropship self illumination. And we're going to drag this into the comp, and again, make sure collapse transformations is enabled, and just double click on the dropship self illumination comp, select all of the dropship specular footage files, and we're going to replace them so with the dropship self illumination. So select dropship self illumination in your project panel, alt click drag on top of the specular, on any one of the specular channels that you have selected there, and release, and they'll all become self-illumination. So now what we have is we have nicer, brighter glows on the dropship lights here. So like you can notice the little running lights here and here, they have nice soft glows to them. Okay. Next what we'll do is we'll take all of this footage, and then we'll pre-comp this as well, and we'll call this dropship. Shift Control C again for those of you who are still kind of new to After Effects. That allows you to pre-comp it. So hit OK, and that looks good. Collapse transformations again, and that looks fine. Next what we'll do is we'll drag in the background just below the dropship layer here, and maybe we'll brighten up the colors a little bit. Maybe I'll add an exposure adjustment. I used to use levels and curves a lot. Levels is more for big adjustments, curves is more for minute adjustments, and exposure is kind of a happy medium between the two. And if we bring up the exposure amount, we can kind of see this little blue nebula coming into view here. 1.75 should be all right. Maybe I'll drag the gamma correction down to 0.75, and that looks okay. Actually, maybe I'll leave it at 1, and then I'll add a camera lens blur to this. Nothing too extravagant here. Repeat on edges, roundness of 100%, and I'll leave the blur amount at 5. That looks pretty good. So now what we can do is, and what we have here so far is we just have the dropship traveling in space. So what we need to do now is we need to implement the shield effect itself. So what we'll do is we'll do the shockwave element first. So we'll just drag the shockwave element into our new comp over top of the dropship, and drag our time slider over here a little bit. Like right about here. Oh, okay, I see what's going on here. So something we have to do is we have to interpret the footage here. So go to interpret footage main, and we'll set this to ignore the alpha channel, and we'll choose OK. It's because we set the material of the shockwave to add in 3D Studio Max, and that's why it didn't render with an alpha channel. So we'll just set this to add in After Effects as well, and now the shockwave is showing up here, so that's pretty good. That's good news, everyone. Alright, cool. So there's the shockwave here, and what we can do next is we can pre-comp this. So Shift Control C and move all attributes into the comp, and we'll call this shockwaves, and we'll hit enter. And what we're gonna do is we'll just add a bit of a fast blur to this, so maybe 1 pixel for now, and then repeat the process that we did for the self-illumination and specular channels on the dropship. So we'll duplicate, double the blur amount, duplicate, double the blur amount, duplicate, double the blur amount, etc. until we're satisfied here. I'm going to do this up to 32 pixels, so that should leave us with about 6 layers. You know what, maybe 1 more. And then that should be 64, and that should leave us with about 7 layers. Okay, so next what we need to do is we need to add a new adjustment layer. And what we'll do is we'll do a curves adjustment here. And we're going to make this really blue. Maybe kind of like this, just the green channel like so, and bring the red down. And that looks pretty cool. So you'll notice that this is all black. So what we need to do is we need to set the mode to add, and that looks all right. Now we'll do the same thing for the particles. So we'll duplicate the shockwaves layer in the project panel here, Control D or Command D on Mac, and right click on the shockwaves 2 layer, and we'll call composition, sorry, and we'll call this particles, and we'll hit OK. Drag this down over top of the shockwaves, and again set this to add. And what we'll do is we'll double click, go into the particles layer, select all the shockwave elements, and as before, select particle render from the project viewport, alt click, drag over top of the shockwave elements, and that's odd. Okay, we have an anomaly, folks. The particles are not showing up, and I think I know the reason why. So again, interpret footage main, ignore the alpha channel, and there they are. Choose OK. Yes, okay, that looks good. Alright, so there they are. Now, I'll do a quick RAM preview here, show you guys how this looks so far. Alright, so the impacts look a little small. I'm going to go back into 3D Studio Max and re-render them. We do need to go back into Max anyway for the next part of this tutorial, so I'll see you guys there. Alright everybody, I'm back. I did increase the size of the particles a little bit. The shield impact shockwave, I increased the length and width to about 1500 and the box height to about 2300. And for the shield impact particle explosions, I increased the size of that to 2000 for length and width. So, alright, so we are back in 3D Studio Max, and for the next part of this tutorial, we're going to be creating the almighty hexagon pattern. So I'll disable the shield particles in layer for a second, and we'll go back into the shield geometry, and what we're going to do is we're going to clone this shield impact geometry, and we're going to call this shield geometry. Hex pattern. And we'll choose OK. And in the object properties here, we're going to make sure that that renderable is checked. Turn off receive and cast shadows, and turn off see-through as well. And we're going to put this in its own layer, so hex shield, if I can spell, and choose OK, and turn off shield geometry there, and this should be the only thing that we have left in our viewport right now. So what we're going to do next is we're going to create a new material for this sphere. So in our material editor, we're going to create a new material, and we're going to call this hex pattern, and in our maps, I grabbed a quick image from freepik.com. That's FREEPIK, freepik.com. And I actually really like this pattern here because the hexagons are there, but they're not quite touching, but they are still lined up. So this will serve our purposes pretty well. So I'm just going to drag the hex pattern into the diffuse color slot here, and we'll notice right away that we got this hex pattern, which is very, very nice. So set the diffuse color to black, drag the image into the self-illumination slot as an instance, and we could just apply this and be done with it, and just render this out as an image sequence, but we're going to do a few extra things to this. So in the bitmap settings, first we're going to tile it a little bit so to make it appear a bit more complex. So maybe we'll do 4x2, and that looks pretty good. How about 4x3? That looks better actually, so more symmetrical. So quick render preview here, and that looks pretty nice. But we're gonna do a little bit more. So if we click this bitmap here, what we're gonna do is we're gonna add a composite map to this. So select composite, choose OK, keep the old map as a submap, and choose OK. And what we're going to do is we're going to add a new layer into this composite layer. This is just like compositing in After Effects. So if you know all the compositing methods, this should be easy peasy. So in the new layer, we're going to add a noise map. So just select noise. I'm going to make this fractal noise. And you can see that the noise is kind of overtaking the hexagon pattern here. We'll fix that in a moment, but we'll set the levels to 10. And I'll auto key it so that it changes the phase over 5 seconds. So as we drag the time slider around, we'll notice that the noise pattern is animating, and that looks pretty good. So what we'll do is we'll set this pattern to average, and we'll also set this pattern to average as well. And that looks alright. And I'll go back up and we'll drag the diffuse color composite map into the self-illumination slot here, and choose OK, and do a quick render, make sure everything looks good, and that looks alright. Maybe we can play around with the noise size a little bit. Maybe we'll shrink it down a little bit just to see. No, that's too small. What if we bring that to 250? Okay, maybe it was better at... Maybe we'll set this to 100, and if not, then we'll just put it back to 25. I think it looks alright at 100. So, one more thing that we need to do. We had to enable our lights. So what layer were they on here? Okay, shield particles. So, we'll enable our lights and we'll just quickly turn them off. We want this shield to be rendered without any outside light influence. So, that looks pretty good, and what we'll do is we'll quickly render this over into a new composition, a new folder. We'll call this Hex Shield, and OK, and call this Hex Shield Element. No, render. Sorry. And once we render this, we can bring this into After Effects, and then we'll be able to make the hex shield impact happen. So I'll see you guys back in After Effects. Alright, so we're back in Adobe After Effects, and like I said before, I increased the size of my particles so they do look a little bit bigger now. The shield impacts and the shockwaves both look a little bit bigger, which is good. So the trick to getting the hexagonal pattern to look good is we import it as it looked in 3D Studio Max after we turn off all the lights and everything. And so what we'll do is we'll import our image sequence of the hex shield. And straight unmatted, that looks alright. And we'll put this in its own folder. Hex shield. Okay. And again, we're gonna Control-Alt-C, Control-Alt-V, make sure that it's reading at 24 frames per second. Sorry. So to accomplish, so like I said, there are two different methods that we can do this. We can use this shield. One is we can just drop it straight on top, do a bit of color correction, and we'll essentially have the Halo style bubble effect. The other is where the shock waves themselves actually reveal the shield, which is kind of like the StarCraft 2 method. So we're going to cover the Halo method first. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop the Hex Shield render into a new composition here, and we're going to call this Hex Shield. And what we'll do is we're going to duplicate this 3 times. 1, 2, 3. So we got 4 layers here. And for the bottom layer, we're going to do a bit of a fast blur on it. Just drop a fast blur here. Repeat edge pixels, and we're going to set this to about maybe 25 pixels. And you'll notice that it kind of has a sort of a soft edge around it, and that's what we want. So we're going to set this to add. And for the first 2 layers, we're going to set the second layer as a Luma inverted matte to the first layer. So select Luma inverted matte, and that didn't do what I hoped it would. So give me a second here, folks. Make sure that it's interpreted correctly. Okay. Oh, alpha inverted matte. I apologize. So, alpha inverted matte, and what the alpha inverted matte does is, see this little ring right here? That's exactly what we want. So, we're gonna fast blur both of these elements. We're gonna blur this one by maybe about 5 pixels. 25 is a bit much, and then repeat on edges, and then we're going to blur the matte itself. So bring that down to about 5 pixels, maybe a bit more than that actually. How about 10? And then we'll set the second layer to add, and then we'll turn on our layers, and you'll notice that there's a bit of a faint halo edge around this around the shield, and that's exactly what we want. And if this method looks familiar, it's because the same method is used to actually create atmospheres around planets in After Effects as well. You can use this method to create planetary atmospheric rings around it, so like the blue glow around the Earth, for instance, if you ever had to composite a planet. So next what we'll do is we'll go back into the main comp here, and we're going to drag the Hex Shield comp right over top of the dropship here. And doesn't look very good right now, but don't worry, we'll fix it. So what we'll do is, excuse me, set the layer to add, and what we'll do is we'll add an invert effect to it. So channel invert. So drag this here. Now the hexagons stand out a little bit better, and that's pretty cool. And what we'll also do is we'll add an exposure effect as well to darken the darks, as it were. And I just want to adjust it just so that it looks like we can still see the dropship inside of it. So maybe we'll take down the gamma correction to about 0.45 and maybe bring down the exposure amount to about -2. And finally what we'll do is we'll add a curves adjustment. So curves, and maybe we'll make this blue as well. So that looks alright, and that looks good, and there we have it. This is the more Halo type shield effect, where the shield is constantly visible. In Halo itself, of course, it's more of a yellow gold type color. You can do that really quickly, so we'll just bring up the red, bring down the blue a little bit, and that looks more like the let me readjust the green channel a little bit here. This looks more like the Halo style, the Halo 3 style bubble shield that we saw in the trailers, and we all got hyped up for it. The other method that I'm going to show you guys is the more StarCraft 2 Protoss type energy shield. So That's the one where the shockwaves reveal it. So I'm going to readjust the colors here back to what they were. And, oops. Maybe I'll bring the, and I'll turn off the exposure effect right now. So what we need to do in order to make the hex shield get revealed is we need to add a shockwave element over top of it. So like this, and set the hex shield layer to Luma matte the shockwave element. And what we're going to do is we're gonna blur out the shockwave quite a bit. So fast blur, just drop that on. You can use a Gaussian blur too if you feel it might help out a little bit. Blur it out quite a bit, maybe about to 150. And you'll notice here that it's very subtle, but it's starting to, the hexagons are starting to appear here. So what we'll do now is we'll add another exposure effect to the shockwave element layer and just bring it up. So maybe about up to 5, and then gamma correction we can adjust that as well. And that looks pretty good. So we'll do a quick render here. Quick RAM preview. Alright, that doesn't look too bad. There's a couple more adjustments I think that we can make. For example, the hex shield itself. Maybe we could mess around a little bit more with the color. Maybe we'll turn off the curves adjustment, see how that looks. And it actually looks kind of red. I'm not a huge fan of that. So what we can do is maybe we can solo this layer, and maybe we can bring down the exposure just a little bit, maybe down to 2.5, and maybe we can even affect the Luma matte. So maybe we'll add a curves adjustment in here and bring up the blue some. And it doesn't look like that's really doing much, to be honest with you. So maybe what we'll do is we can add a solid composite. Set that to black. Bring that up. And maybe then we can try tint effect. And again, it's not doing much. Oh, maybe it needs to be applied to the hex shield layer. So maybe I'll do that. I'll take these two elements, copy them, and then paste them here. That looks better. Alright, so drag the solid composite layer up here, maybe before the invert, and maybe I'll set the tint amount to 75%. Maybe even about 50%. Now, you know what, I'm not too happy with the tint effect. I'll just remove it, and then instead I'll just go with the blur, the curves adjustment, I'm sorry, and then I'll bring the green down. And adjust the main RGB channel here. And see how that looks. That looks pretty good. But yeah, you guys get the idea. I'll let this RAM preview out so you guys can see the final result here. Alright, so that looks pretty good. Alright, well, that's it for this tutorial, so thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope this really helps you out on your animation projects and whatever else you might have planned. So if you really like this tutorial, like, comment, subscribe. We got a lot more on the way, and if you really like this tutorial, consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/burningearthvfx and help support the channel. I'll put your name in the credits of every video that we release if you do. and maybe more depending on how much you donate. So again, thanks so much for watching, guys, and I hope you guys learned something new here. So alright, that's it. I'm Burning Earth Chris, and I'll see you guys next time. Take care. If you like this video, consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/burningearthvfx. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.